On a sweltering hillside, South Ossetian forces ready themselves for war. Most of these men saw action last year. They know all too well how quickly simmering tensions with Georgia can flare up into a full-scale conflict.
Judging by the statements coming from the Georgian president, there is a clear potential for war.
Last year, the South Ossetian army were quickly outnumbered by advancing Georgian troops. This time, they say, they're ready.
While the Georgian forces fail to be condemned internationally, and while the Georgian leadership that committed these acts is still in power, the danger of a repetition of the aggression still exists.
The South Ossetian authorities claim there's been a sharp increase in Georgian attacks ahead of the anniversary of the war. These women say their children were abducted by Georgian troops.
We don't know who stopped and detained them or where they are. We've been searching for them for 9 months.
Officials are mounting evidence of what they claim are Georgian provocations.
So here you found... Yes. You found this?
Yes. This rocket-propelled grenade, they say, was fired by Georgian troops into South Ossetian territory this week. Georgia denies the charges, claiming the South Ossetians have launched their own attacks on Georgian patrols. A year ago, the hills above Skinvali were used by forces from both sides to bombard the South Ossetian capital. And here, not too far away, at the border crossing at Erganati, one can see both the Russian and South Ossetian flags flying high side by side, only a matter of meters away from the closed Georgian border. Forces on both sides still say that sporadic attacks continue, and it's feared that any further violence may be used as a pretext for another conflict.
We're worried for the population that went through all of this last year. People are very worried that there will be a new war. The only comforting fact is that Russia's Ministry of Defense have promised to protect the population from any possible attacks.
Russia has put its 800 troops stationed in South Ossetia on high alert. Georgia accuses Russia of making creeping advances into the territory with a view to annexing the region. Despite declaring itself independent from Georgia last year, most South Ossetians would prefer to be part of Russia.
South Ossetia always lived together with Russia, not just today, but in the past and in the future.
We are fed up with people trying to kill us. Now we want to be part of Russia.
The separatist president, Edward Kokoity, enjoys firm Russian support. Reconstruction projects are conducted with Moscow's help. The clear message from the Kremlin is that if Georgia ever tries to reclaim the territory, Russia is ready to use whatever force it takes to stop them. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera, Skinval, South Ossetia.
Columns of Georgian tanks and troops heading for the South Ossetian capital, Skinvali. They'd come to subdue a town and a region under separatist control. And for a while they claimed to have done it. But Russian armour, units of the 58th Army, were approaching from the Russian border, sent to reinforce peacekeepers and to protect a civilian population that Russia calls its own. By day's end, the Georgians admitted that heavy Russian air support had cost them control of the town. Earlier, Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili spoke confidently of Georgia's aims and called Russia the ultimate provocateur.
The Russian Federation has bombed the Georgian territory. Populated and peaceful areas have been bombed. It is nothing but a classic international aggression.
Russian President Dmitry Medvedev spoke confidently too of Russia's response.
Now in South Ossetia, peaceful people are dying. Women, children, old people. The majority of them are citizens of the Russian Federation. In accordance with the Constitution and laws of this country, I am, as the President, obliged to defend the lives and dignity of our people, wherever they may be.
Georgian troops continue to pour into Skinvali and its surrounds. The fighting goes on, plumes of smoke rising there above the capital of South Ossetia. Georgia insists it had no choice in taking this decision to restore order, so-called, inside South Ossetia. But the choice it has taken is a dramatic and potentially dangerous one. Russia is watching extremely closely. Its peacekeepers on the ground have already suffered casualties, and with reports of hundreds and hundreds of volunteer fighters and Russian troops potentially crossing the border from Russia, this situation could easily turn from bad to far worse. The scale of the damage was shown in footage from inside Skinvali. Civilian victims too in the nearby town of Gori. Georgia, meanwhile, says Russia's actions could bring the two countries into full-scale war. For those too afraid to leave South Ossetian villages and towns, war must surely be the only word to describe it. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, on the Georgian-South Ossetian border.
If it's not war, then we are very close to it, said one Georgian official on Friday. As tanks rolled into this disputed region, the UN Security Council met in New York.
La séance est levée. The meeting is adjourned.
Agreement proved elusive as both sides failed even to agree on how the situation had escalated. Hours later, a second meeting was convened to try once again. Georgia says South Ossetia, backed by Russia, had prompted the outbreak of violence, while Russia cites Georgia's aggressive actions.
The Georgian government has acted extremely aggressively in southern Ossetia. They have in fact started combat action using heavy arms, artillery and tanks.
Georgia has been pursuing closer ties with the West. To that, Russia has always objected.
This is Russia's strategy of preventing Georgia from integrating into the West in general and in NATO in particular.
This fighting, which kicked off a week ago, has in fact destabilized the Caucasus since the fall of the Soviet Union. It's already claimed the lives of many and has sent thousands of South Ossetian civilians pouring across the border into Russia earlier this week. It was perhaps the most obvious signal the violence was about to escalate. South Ossetia wants full independence from Georgia and has been fighting for that with Russian political and financial backing. That has been a thorn in the side of Georgia's president, Mikhail Saakashvili.
It's a very, very risky thing to go to war in South Ossetia. Russia is not going to stand idly by and see its small little ally, South Ossetia, be attacked in this way. So the Georgians can win a short-term victory there, but there's bound to be a Russian response which could provoke a much larger Russian-Georgian fight.
Georgia has focused its strategic gaze west. The country has become an increasingly valuable energy highway, delivering oil and gas from the Caspian Sea directly to Europe. Georgia wants membership of NATO, and not surprisingly, Russia has become increasingly skeptical of any plans to expand that alliance. The Caucasus have long been a potential flashpoint for the powers jockeying for influence over this oil and gas-rich region, and now the civilian population is paying the price.
Russia is directly engaged in military aggression against Georgia. Not only it arms and supports and facilitates the military escalation against Georgia by proxies, but it directly sends its own warplanes to bomb Georgian territory. It's a war, Russian war against Georgia. And it is a challenge of international community. They need to respond. They need to talk to Russia very, very firmly. We don't want Europe or any other countries to have some sort of problems, big problems with Russia. We realize so many countries are dependent on Russian supplies. But unless European Union, the Western general stands for the values it is united around, the situation will not stop in Georgia. And the appeasement, it has proved not to be working in the past. It's not going to work today. Our government has been warning Russia that support of separatism, sending so-called volunteers, will come back to Russia and they will have to pay a price. And unfortunately, it proved to be true, because those fighters from Chechnya, including Mr. Basayev, Gelayev, and other liberation war heroes, then turned to be international terrorists as soon as they started fighting against Russia. Now they are making the same mistake, allowing so-called volunteers to enter Georgia and to fight against Georgian people and Georgian government. Well, it's not going to be, I'm not sure they will remain immune from the same problem that they would have to pay a big price for that. Direct negotiations have been rejected day after day by separatist leaders, and it is our clear impression now that they were never interested in negotiating solution. Georgia is open to negotiations. Georgia is ready to grant amnesty to all the separatist leaders if they lay down the arms and go back to the negotiating table. And we invite Russia to mediate during these talks. The problem is that we don't see Russia being very active and managing to bring our supposed partners to those talks. Nowadays, this is Russia's strategy of preventing Georgia from integrating into the West in general and in NATO in particular. So we have the forthcoming NATO ministerial in December, where Georgia's membership action plan will be discussed, and we view this latest escalation as a message towards the West. Even when President Saakashvili yesterday declared unilateral ceasefire and ordered Georgian police forces not to respond to the separatist firing, they probably took this as a message of weakness or a sign of weakness, and they intensified the fire where Georgian civilians and police forces suffered large losses. This was the triggering point when we just didn't have any other choice to suppress the fire. Georgians and Ossetians in the region are very closely connected. There is no ethnic conflict there. We would like to make it very clear. Secondly, Georgian government has offered the region, all peoples of the region, the utmost degree of autonomy. As soon as we have a political solution to the conflict, the region will be able to elect its parliament, its own president. The ethnic rights, the cultural rights of the ethnic Ossetians will be protected to the highest European level. And we offer a better future within a democratic, stable, prosperous European Georgia than they could have anywhere else. So the main point of the Georgian government is to establish, first of all, to establish the peace, and then it's ready to allocate very substantial financial resources for the rehabilitation of the region, for its development. Russia seems to be just adding oil to fire by sending weapons, sending armored vehicles through Rocky Tunnel, and so-called volunteers from Northern Caucasus. And at the top of everything, of course, there are air raids on Georgian territory. Once again, we're calling upon Russia to play a more constructive role to stop military aggression against Georgia for the benefit of Ossetian people living in the region and for the benefit of all peoples. And this should be in Russia's own interest, because every time when Russia stirs trouble on the south from its border, then it comes back as a boomerang in the Northern Caucasus, which is a very, very volatile region, as we all know.
Heading for the front line, Georgian troops are now pouring into South Ossetia. This trainload passing through the town of Sinaki in the west of the country. All around them, evidence of the enemy they're about to face. The damage caused by Russian air attacks litters the streets and would appear to back Georgian claims that it's civilians being targeted. Their president made this appeal to the Western world to come to their aid.
I think it's time to move from words to acts, because this is not going to go away. And this nation is right now fighting for its survival, but we are also fighting for world peace, and we are also fighting for future world order.
And his most important ally called for an immediate end to the violence and, pointedly, an end to the Russian bombing.
I'm deeply concerned about the situation in Georgia. The United States takes this matter very seriously. The attacks are occurring in regions of Georgia far from the zone of conflict in South Ossetia. They mark a dangerous escalation in the crisis. The violence is endangering regional peace. Civilian lives have been lost, and others are endangered.
Georgian television has been broadcasting pictures from inside a hospital in the port city of Poti. It says many people were injured when Russia bombed the city on the Black Sea coast, although it gave no precise figures for the number of casualties. The pictures also show signs of damage to the port buildings, part of what the Georgian authorities say is a series of attacks on the country's infrastructure. Targets, it's claimed, include a military base and civilian buildings. Russian viewers have been shown their soldiers being treated in a hospital just across the border from South Ossetia. They were part of a unit of peacekeepers which came under fire in the South Ossetian capital of Skin Valley. This sergeant said the Georgian soldiers were the first to open fire. He said we were defending our positions as long as we could. The Russians say 15 of their soldiers were killed during the fighting. At Tbilisi airport, crowds of people are waiting to flee the country. This Russian woman broke down in tears as she told how she was leaving her husband behind, and she pleaded for an end to the fighting. But all the signs are that both sides are preparing for a long campaign. These Georgian reservists have just been called up, assembling in the central square in Gori near the border with South Ossetia. This 20-year-old student said he was ready to fight. Harry Smith, Al Jazeera.
The war, for surely it must now be called a war, is widening. These images of the aftermath of a morning raid by Russian warplanes on the Georgian town of Gori, 30 kilometers from the front. Gori has become the staging post for Georgian forces. The Russian attacks may have been intended for military targets. Some missed. Most of these Georgian soldiers haven't seen the front line yet. They're fresh-faced reservists ready to go in, called up in President Saakashvili's full military mobilization on Friday. Georgia continues to insist that Russia is the aggressor in all of this. But one question mark remains. Was this a pre-planned assault timed to coincide with world leaders being preoccupied with the Olympic Games in Beijing? That may have been the calculation of either Georgia, Russia or the South Ossetian side. As the world watches the Games, this conflict is getting worse. It's part of Russia's promised response to the deaths of what President Dmitry Medvedev called Russian compatriots, peacekeepers in South Ossetia and a civilian population there that Russia has effectively made its own. Georgian and Russian forces are continuing the battle for the South Ossetian capital Skin Valley. Throughout a second night and into another day, what remains of the capital is under assault now from two armies.
Today I am signing a decree to ask Parliament to declare martial law. Georgia is being attacked by the Russian Federation. The country is under a full military invasion. This aggression is not just towards Skin Valley, but also Abkhazia is under attack.
Now in South Ossetia, peaceful people are dying. Women, children and the elderly. The majority of them are citizens of the Russian Federation. In accordance with the constitution and laws of this country, I am, as President, obliged to defend the lives and dignity of our people, wherever they may be.
Civilians are paying heavily. The Red Cross says hospitals in South Ossetia are overflowing. Refugees, those that can, are crossing into Russia. Unexpectedly, attention will now also have to focus on innocent lives at stake in Georgia itself. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Gori. The war, for surely it must now be called war, is widening. This the aftermath of morning raids by Russian warplanes on the town of Gori. Gori has become the staging point for Georgian forces. The Russian attacks may have been intended for military targets. Some missed.
24 hours ago, I was reporting from outside a town in flames in South Ossetia. A day later, and another town is burning. More civilians have been killed, this time in Georgia, here in Gori.
The apartment buildings are adjacent to a Georgian tank base, the target from the air. It simply cannot have been unforeseeable that civilians would be caught up in this attack. Elsewhere, moments after another explosion, these are Georgian reservists. Some have as little as 1 week's training. Commanders tried to restore order as the men scattered in panic. The injured hurried to hospital. The town of Gori is emptying fast. Those who can are heading for nearby villages or the capital Tbilisi. Others insist they'll stay, counting the cost of Saturday's surprise attacks.
This is my city. I was born here and I've lived here all my life.
No one in Gori saw this coming. The conflict zone they thought was 30 kilometers away. The Russians have brought it much closer. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, in Gori.
The Russia-Georgia war, which erupted as a battle for a disputed breakaway region, has fast spilled over into surrounding areas. Who are the likely winners and losers in this conflict, and who has the power to end it? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Lauren Taylor. A possible domino effect as events move rapidly in the confrontations between Georgia and Russia. Neighbouring Ukraine has warned that it may bar Russian ships from returning to their base in Ukraine. And the US has spoken of the potential for significant impact on US-Russian relations. Jonah Hull has this report.
On the road to the border and South Ossetia. Early on Saturday morning, Georgia began its withdrawal from the capital Skinvali. This, one of the retreating convoys, now well inside Georgia.
But was this a retreat or a repositioning? The Georgians say Russia is massing troops and armour on the border 35 kilometres to the north.
New Georgian positions that we saw on the road looked defensive, preparing perhaps for a Russian advance into Georgia itself. The situation in Skinvali remains uncertain, but very close by in the neighbouring separatist region of Abkhazia, there are worrying developments. Abkhaz fighters supported by Russia are on the move, widening their area of control. Strategic Georgian positions have been attacked here, and the Russians are said to have landed 4,000 troops delivered by its Black Sea naval fleet. Georgia says 6,000 more are on the ground elsewhere, preparing for a full-scale invasion. In Gori, the town that saw the heaviest of Russia's aerial assault on Georgian military targets on Saturday, people are leaving fast.
We are leaving our village because we are expecting that Russian will attack us. They are bombing us, and we are going to go to Tbilisi and other cities.
Are you afraid?
Yes. Yes, very, very.
This is a chess club in the town of Gori. The pieces are all laid out, but there's nobody playing. Why? Because this is a building like many others in Gori that felt the effect of Saturday's Russian aerial assault. For all practical purposes now, this is a town in which normal civilian life has ceased to exist.
Thousands of ethnic Ossetians have left South Ossetia for Russia. In Georgia, people are heading for the capital Tbilisi. Right now, there's no guarantee of safety anywhere in Georgia. Jonah Hull for Inside Story in Gori.
Well, joining us now are our guests. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer. He's a defence analyst and columnist for the Novaya Gazeta newspaper. In Paris, Nino Kirtadze. She's a Georgian filmmaker and a former presidential advisor. And in Washington, D.C., Richard Weiss. He's the Associate Director of the Hudson Institute's Center for Future Security Strategies and an expert on U.S. policy towards Eurasia. If I go to Paris first, and Nino Kirtadze, do you think this was a big miscalculation by Georgia?
Hello. You know, I don't know exactly how it all started, but I don't know. I don't know whether it was any calculation at all. But the only thing that I know, because I've been speaking constantly to my parents who live in Georgia, to all my friends out there, that now nobody knows where it's going to end, because the reaction that the Russians had was totally out of control and totally disproportional. So, I mean, my main worries are these now. I don't know, again, to come back to your question, whether it was miscalculation or what it exactly was, because now it's very difficult to say who started what, and basically I was in Paris and not there, so, you know.
Pavel Felgenhauer, do you think this, the reaction, as Nino said there, it was disproportionate?
I don't really think that there was a real big possibility that Russia would just simply move out and allow Georgia to settle its problems with Ossetia just simply by using force and routing the Ossetians. I also believe that the conflict was basically inevitable, and it would have happened anyway, no matter who moved, and most likely the Georgian leadership and Saakashvili and his military advisors decided to move first to have the advantage of the initiative. And to put Russia into a kind of a rather perplexed situation, because this war was coming up. It was basically pre-planned, but the Georgians apparently mixed the cards a bit for the Russians.
Okay, Richard Weitz, what's your view? Do you think it was inevitable, this conflict, as our guest suggests?
Yes, I have to agree with that interpretation. I think that insofar as this has been going on for a decade now, there have been various negotiating platforms, there have been various mechanisms to try and spur progress, and there really wasn't much movement in the diplomatic front. And so I think it was just a question of some spark to set off the conflict. And I agree with our first speaker, it's unclear what started it, but certainly the events that follow were fairly predictable.
So why do you think that Russia is doing this? I mean, is the aim ultimately to destabilize Georgia, and Russia was spoiling for a fight, and this was the opportunity to do something like this?
I don't think Russia was spoiling for a fight, because I think if you look at the last week, the Russian response was a bit delayed. I think they were caught off guard like the rest of us to the escalation. I do think, though, at this point Russia has decided that it makes sense to try and settle the conflict more or less on a longer-term basis by solidifying its control over South Ossetia, driving the Georgians out of Abkhazia, conducting military operations elsewhere in Georgia to degrade the strength of the Georgian military, and ideally convince the West not to let Georgia into NATO. Many of the Europeans have been expressed concern that bringing Georgia into the alliance would actually drag them into a war with Russia, and I think this is going to reinforce those fears.
Okay.
So I think Russia's response is strategically planned and well thought out, if regrettable.
Okay. Nino Kitadze, on that point about NATO membership, will Georgia now be thinking, well, actually, we haven't had any help or assistance from our friends in the West on this occasion. Perhaps NATO membership wouldn't be such a brilliant idea after all?
You know, now people are really worried, and they're all in front of their televisions trying to understand what's going to be international reaction, because everybody is hoping that this is the only thing that can possibly stop Russia of going further. But coming back to NATO, I think that if Russia were to be just obedient to, if Georgia was to be obedient to Russia, we will never be there, actually. I mean, Saakashvili's government irritates Russia because they're pro-Western, because they want to get into NATO, and basically they don't want to see these old colonies to slip away. So that's the one way of explaining why Russia is so angry, and so, I mean, why it is using such methods now. On another hand, what Georgia is going to do, I mean, certainly after all that had happened, and if you look closely to Russian and Georgian relationship, they've been deteriorating for these last 7-10 years. It's getting worse and worse. So I don't think that Georgians will go back to be with Russia and accept this big neighbor and just be obedient. So they will try still to go to NATO, because somehow this for Georgia means to stop these kind of things happening in our territory, you know.
But let me just bring in Pavel Felgenhauer on that point. Do you think Russia's aim with such a sort of strong military action was to send a message not just to its neighbours, but also a bigger international message about Russia's power?
Well, surely, but I mean, on different levels, there were different objectives. The Ossetian and Abkhaz separatists believe that a conflict in which Russia is going to be fighting on their side will mean that Russia will recognize their sovereignty and solve their problems.
And will it? I mean,
there are there are Russians who believe that we should kind of begin rebuilding the empire by annexing these small separatist republics. There are people in Georgia who believe that Georgians have a fine military and can actually use it now to solve some problems. So there's lots of, on different levels, but on the top level in Moscow, of course, the different kind of quarrels between Georgians, Ossetians, Abkhazs, and other small Caucasian tribes are not that important. There's a lot of personal enmity, right, between former president, now prime minister, the strong man in Moscow, Vladimir Putin, and Georgian president Mikhail Saakashvili. But for the top leadership in the Kremlin, in Moscow, the main problem is NATO expansion, Georgia becoming part of NATO. For them, that's the main reason.
Okay, Richard Weiss, if I could bring you in, this whole point about NATO and what how it might expand. I mean, do you think that, I mean, it's been a very clear message from the United States that they're not going to get involved in this, and the international community doesn't seem to be particularly keen on getting involved in this dispute at all. So where does that leave the relationship between a country like Georgia and the US, which is supposed to be an ally?
I think that it's going to lead to deterioration in the relationship, and I think that's probably one of Russia's ideal objectives on several levels. One, I think the campaign to bring Georgia into NATO is going to weaken even in Washington. Two, there are many people in Washington who think that blame the Georgian leadership in part for what's happened. There is a sense that the current president and his entourage miscalculate how much support they're going to get from the West, and perhaps try to undertake a military coup de main, seize the territory, and present the world with a fait accompli. And that's going to make people more reserved about backing his entry into NATO. In addition, the Georgians have now recalled their troops from Iraq, and in the long term, that was seen as a mechanism, I wish, to strengthen the military alliance. So I think within limits, I mean, the relationship always remains strong, but I think that the current very high-level relationship will deteriorate somewhat. I think there's been new sources of tension introduced into the relationship.
The area being fought over is South Ossetia. It's a relatively small territory of around 2,300 square kilometres, 100 kilometres north of the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. This latest fighting is not the first the region has seen since the fall of the Soviet Union. Hundreds died in violent clashes between 1991 and 92 as South Ossetia attempted to separate from Georgia. Following a peace agreement a year later, the province elected its first president. The country had already drafted its own constitution and declared independence, although this has never been internationally recognised. In 2002, South Ossetia's president, Eduard Kokoity, asked Moscow to recognise the territory's independence and absorb it into Russia. In a 2006 referendum, South Ossetians voted in favour of the split. Georgia then approved a temporary administration for the province. In March this year, South Ossetia called on the rest of the world to recognise it, following the West's support for Kosovo's break from Serbia. And in April, the region rejected a power-sharing deal with Georgia, insisting on full independence. Well, still with us are our guests. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer; in Paris, Nino Kotadze; and in Washington, D.C., Richard Weiss. Nino Kotadze, if I could ask you, do you think this is, in part, all about what happened over Kosovo? That this has sort of sparked this
kind of... course. No, I think this accelerated the whole thing, because I was filming in Russia at that time, and it was said openly by Russian politicians that if the West was to recognize Kosovo's independence, next would be Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And they were absolutely openly talking about backing up these regions in the Georgian territory. So it's just the second part of the story. And I have to say that for 10 years already, Russia has been distributing Russian passports to this in these regions, and now it's a pretext to protect Russian citizens. So it's not a new story. It has been going like that for years now, since the Soviet Union stopped to exist. And for me, it's all about keeping the influence in the Caucasus.
But Pavel Felgenhauer, would you agree with that? It's simply Moscow trying to reassert old influence in an area which it feels it ought to control?
Well, with that I would agree, of course, but I would very much disagree that Kosovo had any influence on the situation there. None whatsoever. Russian policies were set before that, and actually the real Russian policy is not to recognize these small and impoverished and scarcely populated republics, especially Ossetia, which is really no asset to anyone. The idea was to keep Georgia in Russia's fold, and we were all the time offering Tbilisi the deal that you stay with us, and then the situation will continue. I mean, we organize some kind of confederacy, and legally you'll keep these regions, though we'll, of course, keep them a bit away as a guarantee that you won't go west.
Okay. Richard Weiss, let me bring you in.
It also has nothing to do with this at all.
Okay. Richard Weiss, on that last point, can I bring you in on the idea of it sort of trying to kind of keep the sphere of influence and affect how Georgia looks out on the world? What do you think of that idea? Is it not really about South Ossetia or Abkhazia anymore? It's more about Georgia, is it?
I think that is correct in the sense that I don't think Kosovo had much to change because Russia did not immediately change its policies after Kosovo's declaration of independence. The Russian leaders had sometimes said, well, this is going to be a Pandora's box. If you allow Kosovo an independent, well, then maybe we'll recognize Abkhazia or South Ossetia. But that was always backed away from. It was never made official policy for good reason, because it raises questions about Chechnya. It raises a whole bunch of awkward questions. I think, yes, I think that was the basic idea. I don't know if Russia would have consummated the deal, but the idea was you keep Abkhazia and South Ossetia outside of Tbilisi's control and use that as a mechanism of leverage to try and influence Georgia's policies. And that was not working. The Georgian government was still trying to move closer to NATO in any case.
Okay, Nino Kurtadze, I mean, you know Georgia very well. If Georgia is defeated effectively in this particular war, as everyone seems to be calling it, what's next? Is it the end for Saakashvili?
Well, I think that will be one of the aim that Russia is sort of looking for, because he is irritating Russia a lot with his policy. On another hand, this will be a total tragedy for this small country, because, I mean, you know what does it mean having these bombings all over the country. Nothing to do now with the South Ossetia. It's in Gori, near Tbilisi, the airport has been bombed, Poti has been bombed, Senaki has been bombed. So we don't know at all where it's going to stop. And of course, to bring back stability and make people make sure that people can live there, it will be very, very difficult. Okay. And I don't know how Georgia can handle that.
Can I go back to Moscow now? Pavel Felgenhauer, do you think how much impact do you think there's going to be on energy security? I mean, after all, it's one of the only areas that in the Caspian area that is getting oil and gas out without the Kremlin influence. Presumably, that's a matter of concern for countries outside the Russian sphere.
Well, sure, of course, this war is disrupting oil supplies. The Azeris have already said that they'll stop pumping oil to the Black Sea port of Poti. This is going to disrupt it, and the war is going to continue. I mean, don't think that Georgia has been beaten. The Georgian military and right now already the Russian military, the Russian General Staff says that they are very, very strong and very fine. That's what happened in these several days, that they understood that they're fighting a very formidable enemy, and that Georgian military have not been defeated whatsoever. So the conflict is going to continue, and its outcome is right now unpredictable. And I believe it can cause much worse things than just simply oil not going to Poti. It can cause a major rift between Russia and the West. That because as the conflict develops and escalates, which will most likely will happen, the West will inevitably have to side against Russia.
Okay, on that point, Richard Weitz, what do you think? Is it a major rift developing, do you think, between the West and Russia?
I wish it were so, but I don't think so. I think the Russian leadership calculated correctly that the relationship was poor enough already, and on the one hand, the other hand, NATO, not even Washington was willing to go to war with Russia to defend Georgia. The most there would be is diplomatic protests, as we've seen. So I think the Russians pretty much have a free hand to do what they plan to in Georgia and not suffer major consequences,
And is that
at least from the West.
Is that because Russia views the West's power simply on the wane? I mean, are they doing it because they can?
Well, it's a combination of the West has sort of lost both carrots and sticks in the case of Russia. We can't. The relationship has been poor enough that Russia can't really hope to gain much. I mean, we've decided to deploy the missile defenses in Eastern Europe despite their objections. There's a concern about reviving the American military and doing other steps regardless of what Russia's view is. So there really wasn't much the benefit Russia could see immediately from working closely with the West. On the other hand, there are no real penalties either because the West is sort of ignoring Russia and trying to pursue its more important security goals, and so they weren't really going to suffer, I don't think, any major consequences. I don't think anyone in Washington is prepared to go to war with Russia over Georgia.
Okay, Nino.
So I think they just lack of tools on our part at the moment.
Okay, Nino Kitadze, do you think that Georgia is prepared to keep on fighting, or do you think it's going to try to come up with some sort of a face-saving arrangement and a solution to this?
Well, you know, they already asked for peace talks many times, and I don't think that, you know, Georgia is barely 5 million people, and Russia is 150 million people. How possibly somebody can win this war? You know, if it's war between Georgia and Russia, it's just total disaster. I mean, Georgia would just cease to exist one fine day, and very soon if it continues like that. For me, it's absolutely clear whether Georgian military was trained by Americans or not. It won't make such a decisive point. I don't think so. And I think it's going to be a total disaster if it goes on like that, because you know, it just happened that I was a foreign correspondent working in Chechnya when it started, and nobody could say that at that time it will end like it did end. So, you know, it very much reminds me the beginning of First Chechen War, what's going on now. And I don't know what sort of justification Russian military might have to bomb the whole Georgia like that.
Okay.
For me, it's just beyond understanding.
Okay, on that note, we have to leave it there. I'm afraid we've run out of time. But thank all our guests in Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, in Paris, Nino Kitadze, and in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz. Thank you very much indeed, all three of you, for your time.
On the road to the border and South Ossetia. Early on Saturday morning, Georgia began its withdrawal from the capital Tskhinvali. This, one of the retreating convoys, now well inside Georgia. But was this a retreat or a repositioning? The Georgians say Russia is massing troops and armour on the border 35 kilometres to the north. New Georgian positions that we saw on the road looked defensive, preparing perhaps for a Russian advance into Georgia itself. The situation in Tskhinvali remains uncertain, but very close by in the neighbouring separatist region of Abkhazia, there are worrying developments. Abkhaz fighters supported by Russia are on the move, widening their area of control. Strategic Georgian positions have been attacked here, and the Russians are said to have landed 4,000 troops delivered by its Black Sea naval fleet. Georgia says 6,000 more are on the ground elsewhere, preparing for a full-scale invasion. In Gori, the town that saw the heaviest of Russia's aerial assault on Georgian military targets on Saturday, people are leaving fast.
We are leaving our village because we are expecting that Russian will attack us. They are bombing us, and we are going to go to another country.
This is a chess club in the town of Gori. The pieces are all laid out, but there's nobody playing. Why? Because this is a building like many others in Gori that felt the effect of Saturday's Russian aerial assault. For all practical purposes now, this is a town in which normal civilian life has ceased to exist.
Thousands of ethnic Ossetians have left South Ossetia for Russia. In Georgia, people are heading for the capital, Tbilisi. Right now, there's no guarantee of safety anywhere in Georgia.
These Georgian troops catching a ride home from Iraq on an American military aircraft. And that's about as much military help that Georgia can expect from the U.S. And while Georgia scrambles for a ceasefire, it appears Moscow may be going for it all. That is, to draw new lines of control in both the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. While no one knows for sure who started the most recent fighting, this once simmering conflict has gone to full flame with a string of diplomatic decisions, some of them Washington will have to own up to. It's been a downhill slide in U.S.-Russian relations since it got off to a promising start in Bush's first meeting with Vladimir Putin back in 2001.
I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
But by 2008, at least from Russia's perspective, the dialogue had turned to monologue. Take Washington's insistence to grant Kosovo independence last February, strongly opposed by Moscow.
Independence is the goal, and that's what the people of Kosovo need to know.
At the same time, America began pressing its bid to place missile defense systems in the Czech Republic, something of a throwback to the Cold War era. Then there was Bush's blitz to grant Georgia membership in NATO.
I believe that NATO benefits with a Georgian membership. I believe Georgia benefits from being a part of NATO.
I have to thank you, Mr. President, for your unwavering support for our freedom, for our democracy, for our territorial sovereignty, and for protecting Georgia's borders.
Georgia's president was widely admired by the Bush administration. Tbilisi was even paid its first visit by an American president under Saakashvili's rule.
You gathered here armed with nothing but roses and the power of your convictions, and you claimed your liberty. And because you acted, Georgia is today both sovereign and free and a beacon of liberty for this region and the world.
Of course, Bush was referring to Georgia's 2003 so-called Rose Revolution, which was followed by democratic elections. But like other buzz-named revolutions, including the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, the so-called Rose Revolution has been set ablaze with war, and the U.S. is struggling to find out just how far Russia wants to go.
Is the goal of the Russian Federation to change the leadership of Georgia?
Even if it were, with troops bogged down in both Iraq and Afghanistan, any U.S. military commitment is out of the question, which is why Russia may very well succeed, unopposed, in removing Georgia's military once and for all from both South Ossetia and Abkhazia in coming days. Not good news for Saakashvili, who may soon be joining Washington's graveyard of pro-democracy fallen stars. Clayton Swisher, Al Jazeera.